Thank you everyone for joining us for today's Orr Group's talk, why accountable AI matters and how to get there. Like I said, please drop your name and organization where you're calling in from in the chat box. We want to make this as interactive as possible. There will be some opportunities for Q&A, but we'll ask you to direct those into the Q&A box. But today we're talking accountable AI. As AI becomes more integrated in our lives and work, it's more important than ever to ensure that it's used in a responsible and accountable manner. To mitigate the risks involved in AI usage, organizations have to take steps to ensure that we're being ethical and transparent. So today we're exploring how organizations are approaching accountable AI, and we'll discuss strategies for building and implementing accountable AI programs. Let's start with introductions. Hello, everyone. My name is Terry Cangelosi. I am the Senior Director and Head of Operations at Orr Group. I've been with Orr Group for about 3 years and have been working in operations for almost 15 years. And 10 years prior to my time at Orr Group have been with nonprofits specifically. So I get it from the nonprofit operation side. I understand, and I'm glad you're here joining us. My role at Orr Group covers IT, compliance, contracting, office services. But why I'm talking today is because I also helped stand up our AI task force at Orr Group. And so our AI task force has been working to integrate responsible AI and automation into our workflows and our work product, and to support our nonprofit partners in the field. So in the 2-ish years since its formation, we've created a living AI policy, AI governance, and a public AI disclosure. We've researched and tested over 100 different AI tools. There's a lot more out there, but we've done some due diligence there, and we've created resources for both our staff and for our nonprofit partners. And we've led and developed AI trainings for representatives of over 100 different nonprofit organizations. And I am joined here by Matthew Reisman. Matthew is the Director of Privacy and Data Policy at the Center for Information Policy Leadership, or CIPL. He's a leader with vast experience in responsible use of data and technology, including AI policy and governance, data protection, and enhancing privacy. Working with the team at CIPL, he has helped publish numerous white papers on privacy and responsible AI usage, one of which we'll be going through today. He's got a deep background in privacy and data policy. Like I said, a lot of privacy and data policy here, and previously worked at Microsoft as the Director of Global Privacy Policy, and before that led research on the digital economy at the United States International Trade Commission. He's advised emerging economies on international trade and investment policy through programs funded by the United States Agency for International Development and the World Bank. That was a mouthful, but Matthew, is there anything, thank you so much for joining us, and is there anything you'd like to add in your introduction?
Terry, thanks so much. Thanks so much to Orr Group for welcoming me. Before we dive in, there's, I think, 2 things I want to say. I'm looking through the organizations that folks have identified working with in the chat, and having learned about you and your organization, Orr Group, Terry, I'm honored to be with you, because really, the folks on this call and the folks you're working with as clients at Orr Group are on the forefront of social change. And if anything comes out of this, if we can help do just a little bit to help folks use AI to further your missions more impactfully, that's just an honor to be part of. And you were very kind to read some aspects of my background. Some of the most fulfilling work in my career is work I did with nonprofits and as part of nonprofits earlier in my career. And it's amazing to think about the benefits that we can unleash with this technology. We'll be talking about risks a lot today, but I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we're spending all this time on the risks because the benefits and the potential for those benefits is so high. It's worth taking the time to get it right. Thanks, Terry.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. So a quick overview of what we're going to jump into is we're going to start by sharing what we've been seeing in the field when it comes to nonprofits and AI. Matthew is going to present on a recent paper about building accountable AI programs. I'm going to drop the link in the chat right now. It will be shared after the fact, but it's a robust paper, and you'll be able to You don't necessarily need to follow along at this time. I, in fact, would rather you pay close attention to Matthew's speaking, and then you can dive into the paper afterwards. Then we're going to have a conversation, and we'd love to open it up. And at that point, we'll open it up to the audience for questions. Look, we want to make this as interactive as possible. So keep an eye out for Zoom. There's going to be some polls. We want to get your feedback to help steer this conversation to something that is going to be most applicable and most helpful to those in attendance. I mentioned this at the beginning, but some housekeeping before we get started. The chat is available for discussion. We'll keep an eye on it. I love it. That's a great way for you all to interact with us. We do request that if there are specific questions when we get to the Q&A session, to please use the Q&A button feature at the bottom of your screen for specific questions. You can ask them throughout the webinar. You can ask them right now, and we will hold them off, and then we'll answer them at the end, or if possible, in real time. Great. Let's jump into it. Like Matthew said, it's a pretty exciting time for organizations as we look to the future. There's risk, but there's a lot of opportunity there. And for nonprofits, that presents itself in opportunities to potentially increase the impact of any organization's impact, their mission, et cetera. A recent study from Orr Group surveyed 35,000 people. I read this just on Sunday, so it's fresh in my mind, and it is really interesting to me. Of those 35,000 people, 48% responded saying they used AI on a daily basis. Of those, 75% said AI makes them more productive. And of that group, it said they saved, on an average, an hour per day at work, which is a lot of time if you add it all up. Like adding that an hour a day up over a course of a year is something like a month and a half of work, 6.5 weeks of 40-hour weeks. But I also recognize that us in the nonprofit world sometimes work way more than 40 hours a week. So maybe it won't come out to exactly that, but still some value and opportunity there. And those respondents say it frees up time for more things like creative work, more strategic thinking, broader collaboration, which in turn help drive advancing the organization's mission. I want to share my screen, and I'm going to share just some things that we've been seeing. We've been working with a lot of nonprofit partners in this, in the AI space, and I wanted to share some trends that we've been seeing. So we've been seeing 4 major things. We've been seeing AI integrated into programs. This is AI to support the mission-driven work, whether it's a custom AI solution to drive faster results, or anything else that is advancing the mission. We've seen AI in our fundraising, so to help identify donor trends, personalized communications, outreach, and reach those so you can bring the bucks in the door. AI in the administration. So we got supporting email engagement, just cutting down on that overhead stuff that takes time but is necessary. And lastly, we've just seen a slow adoption. I feel like almost every nonprofit that we've talked to, and Matthew, I'd love you to weigh in here if you've seen the same thing, but there is we've seen a general slow approach to AI. And one of the big factors there is the risks involved.
Yeah, and I will say we've seen that too. I don't want folks in the nonprofit sector to feel picked on. Even within the for-profit sector across different industries, we've seen various levels of call it enthusiasm versus hesitation, trepidation. Sippel, we'll talk a little bit more about how we're structured. We sit within a professional services firm, a law firm, and they've been relatively slow on the uptake. But then also when they dip their toe in the pool, finding that the water feels pretty good with some of the trials. So don't feel alone in being cautious, but also in being willing to dive in.
Awesome. And the 3 things that we've been recommending to our nonprofit partners as we move down this, looking at these trends and where we can go to act on them. And we encourage our partners to focus on using AI responsibly, using AI effectively, and using AI strategically to get that ROI on AI integrated into those three areas. So this talk, we're focused on using AI responsibly. And that's really where we're gonna focus on that. I would love to start with a quick poll of all of our attendees. So this is just, how is your organization using AI? So which of these statements resonate with you? Our organization is already using AI. Many free tools are readily available and they're being integrated into more of our workflows every day. Our organization is avoiding using AI. Some people don't want to navigate the uncertainty around data security, privacy, environmental impact, ethical usage. And our organization is curious about AI. We know there's risks and benefits, but we're not sure to begin. So if any of those three areas resonate you, please fill out this poll. And if it's something else, choose something else, and please drop a comment because I'd love to know other options out there. We're going to give it just a moment to get everyone to respond, and then we're going to share the results in just a second. And just see what the vibe of this group is. All right, I think there's been an opportunity here. If we want to pull down the poll, and then let's see what the results say. Okay. So we got some people already using it, some organizations diving in, using it in the workflow, about a third. We got a few people avoiding it. The do not use, we've seen that across the board too. You know, when in doubt, just say no. And a lot of curiosity and benefits in the risk. So that is a beautiful thing to see. Oh, and we've got something else, and it looks like the piloting an AI program in the next 3 months. So I hope you can gain something from this. But I would say at least 50%. And those actually who are already using it, I do think you're going to find some value, and I hope you can integrate some of these things in here. So today's focus is accountable AI. So accountable AI ensures that you're not adopting AI just for the sake of innovation and opportunity, but to do so with transparency, fairness, trustworthiness, ethical integrity to help mitigate those biases, promote fair decision making. But as we'll talk about, to be successfully adopted, AI must align with the mission-driven program goals, mission-driven values, and internal practices. I'm going to ask my colleague Campbell to put up one more poll. Campbell, thank you so much for being here and helping out with this. I'm going to ask her to put up one more poll before I send it over to you, Matthew, to talk through the findings of the white paper. But on the same idea of ethical AI and responsible AI usage, how confident are you in your organization's understanding of AI and the ethical implications? And just three simple questions. I'd be very curious to see how these compare with the numbers that we received from the last poll based on usage. So we're going to leave this up in just a second. How confident do you feel, Matthew, in your organization's understanding of AI and its ethical implications?
I was hoping for a fourth bubble that was like humbled, because I mean, I feel good about the processes that we're putting in place, but I think as someone already mentioned in the Q&A, the technology is evolving quickly, and so I feel like it's a matter of constant vigilance in terms of staying on top of the latest and doing our best to understand how things work. And as we'll get into, gosh, longer answer probably to your short question than intended, but as long as we're staying grounded in principles, I feel good about where we're going, but also keeping continuous learning in mind.
Yeah, and to just follow up on that same question, and we can see what the results are here in just a second, but yeah, AI tools are, even the same AI tool that existed 6 months ago probably has gone through 6 other iterations since then. And so it is difficult. It's a challenge to find that right tool. I mean, we'll kind of talk about it a little bit, but all of these things are living, breathing, maybe not breathing, that's a little weird, but
Evolving.
evolving documents, and both the documents and the research. What may be an appropriate tool for your organization today, 6 months from now, 3 months from now, next week might no longer be the best case tool because you've spent the time and looked at. So let's pull down this poll and see what the results are. Okay, that's about as even as you can get in this poll, I think. We got some very confident, some not confident, and a whole lot of middle, somewhat confident. Great. So I'm going to send this over to you, Matthew, and you're going to lead us through how companies are leveraging AI while keeping accountability at the forefront of their efforts. And then we're going to open it up to questions. Keep the Q&A box going. As things come up, we'll try to address them. But Matthew, I'm going to send it over to you.
Sounds great. Looking for that first slide.
Oh, yes. One moment. Here we go. Switching over here. All right.
Okay, go on to the next one, please, Terry. So before we dive into the heart of our presentation, I just wanted to share a few words about the Center for Information Policy Leadership, CIPL, where I work. CIPL focuses on helping policymakers, regulators, and organizations across every sector to advance responsible and beneficial approaches to data policy, governance, and use of technology. CIPL sits within a law firm called Hunton Andrews Kurth. Our work is supported by Hunton and about 90 member organizations across a range of economic sectors. Most of our member organizations come from the business world, but we very much welcome nonprofits as well. And if anyone on the call is interested in learning more about CIPL and membership, please do reach out after the session today. Next slide, please. As Terry mentioned, earlier this year, CIPL published Building Accountable AI Programs, Mapping Emerging Best Practices to the CIPL Accountability Framework. The report showcases how 20 leading developers and deployers of artificial intelligence are building accountable AI programs. The report provides evidence of how accountability-based governance frameworks for AI can be effective, shares best practices and lessons learned from leading global organizations implementing this governance, and informs the ongoing and very vigorous global debate on AI regulation and governance. While as you look at the report, you'll see that many of the examples come from larger organizations in the private sector. We do very much feel that the lessons are applicable to small and medium enterprises, nonprofits, and the public sector as well. And Terry and I will get into some of the differences and similarities across sectors. Next slide, please. So we mentioned the word accountability a lot already. Let's take a minute to actually unpack that. What are we talking about? So CIPL has come up with this notion of an accountability framework, and it applies to a lot of applications beyond artificial intelligence. It contains 7 core elements: leadership and oversight, risk assessment, policies and procedures, transparency, training and awareness, monitoring and verification, and response and enforcement. This framework has been used by global organizations as a model for building comprehensive privacy and data governance programs in past years. And our research in this report demonstrated its utility for building programs for responsible development and deployment of AI. And to organize the findings in the report, as you read through it, you'll see that we've mapped best practices that we discovered through our first-person research with these organizations across the 7 elements of the framework. So now let's dive into exactly what we're talking about. So we spent about a year interviewing these organizations, talking with their leading technologists, heads of governance within the organizations to really get into the details of how they're putting AI governance into practice. So let's start at the top of the circle with leadership and oversight. In this case, leadership and oversight means creating effective governance structures, appointing appropriate personnel internally to oversee them, and promoting awareness and support across all functions. It means establishing a tone from the very top of the organization to demonstrate an organization-wide commitment to ethics, values, and specific principles for AI development and use. And for many organizations, it will also mean creating an internal AI ethics oversight body Think of an advisory committee or a board that can weigh in, excuse me, and deliberate on high-risk technologies and use cases and leverage existing business functions within the organization to address AI-related risks. The next step on the circle is risk assessment. Risk assessment involves developing a framework to examine systematically the risks from AI based on likelihood and severity of potential harms and considers potential and available mitigations. We'll dive into this a little bit further in the presentation. Third in our framework is establishment of written AI policies and procedures that frame very clearly our ethical principles, standards, and legal requirements into concrete actions and controls. This includes defining escalation paths for reviewing and reporting high-risk AI, incorporating privacy, AI ethics, or security by design principles into our policies, creating an internal glossary or taxonomy of AI-related terms so that we all agree on what we're talking about. And finally, ensuring that these principles are reflected in any agreements our organizations may have with third parties. And Terry, I wanted to give a shout out to you because I know Orr Group has developed your own set of these sort of principles and policies and procedures. And maybe when we get to discussion, you'd be interested to hear about those examples.
Absolutely.
Under transparency, we mean providing contextualized, relevant information and notices to stakeholders, whether that be customers or clients of our organization, donors to our organization, around our offered AI technologies. It involves tailoring explanatory materials for different audiences and contexts, publishing model cards or fact sheets, and participating in benchmarking activities such as structured public engagement exercises. Next is, and Terry, if I don't let me forget, we should come back to transparency and the perception that customers or the public may have about it versus how we perceive that we're giving it and the delta that may exist there.
Absolutely, yeah. I'm excited to dive into these, but let's get through the circle and then we'll do it.
Sure. All right, we'll come back to that, but don't let me forget. So next is raising employees' awareness of an organization's AI policies and procedures and increasing their understanding through training of relevant topics. This can include providing focused training on AI ethics and principles and cross-functional training between relevant business functions so that even non-technical staff, and especially non-technical staff that may be charged with or asked to use these tools in their daily work functions, have a baseline understanding of how the technologies work and their limitations. So next is monitoring and verification, which is vital for ensuring ongoing compliance and effectiveness of an organization's AI governance program. This can include keeping a, quote, human in the loop where necessary throughout the AI lifecycle. And the notion there is that if there's a lot of concerns that folks often have about things that systems may be doing beyond human control, there's this aspect of keeping people engaged with the systems at all times to be guiding their operations. Also, the notion of conducting adversarial testing, or red teaming as it's called, on AI systems, and we can talk more about that, and conducting periodic audits to assess the effectiveness of an accountable AI program. Finally, response and enforcement. And this has both an internal and an external element. Internally, this means addressing incidents of non-compliance with the policies we may set around use of AI within our organizations, and externally, responding to customer or regulator inquiries. This can include putting in place formal redress mechanisms to remedy potentially harmful AI decisions and leveraging existing communication channels for reporting issues, delivering feedback, and making requests. Next slide, please. So I know this one has a lot of text, and the good news is, I hope I'm not stealing any thunder, Terry. I know that slides we shared with participants after the session. It provides a snapshot of key best practices across each element of this framework. And while I won't go into all of them in depth now, in addition to receiving the slides afterward, if you look into the appendix of our report, you will find all of this information there. If you can go on to the next slide, please, Terry. So we did want to take a few minutes to dive deeper on one of the most frequently discussed topics these days in AI governance, and that's risk assessment. Risk assessment, after the establishment of basic principles, is the first step in operationalizing effective AI risk management. Next slide, please. Developers and deployers of artificial intelligence need to assess risks based on the likelihood and severity of potential harms and consider available mitigations, implement multiple checkpoints for assessment throughout the AI lifecycle, and use novel technological solutions where applicable. We can talk about some of these further, but they can include privacy-enhancing technologies, for example, to reduce privacy risks associated with handling personal data. Risks can come from a variety of domains. We've talked again, this is a word we've used a lot, risk, risk, risk. What are we talking about? For customers of our, or folks who engage with our services, clients, they can include human and civil rights that may be affected by AI systems. They can include privacy. They can include the intellectual property of data that may be processed by the systems. And for the and also for individuals, it can include reputational and even psychological risks that may come from interacting with the systems. For an organization itself, there are also our potential risks, and they can include legal risks, cybersecurity risks, and again, reputational risks, among others. Building on this foundation, AI risk management involves implementing protective, mitigating measures that are proportional to the likelihood and severity of the risks that we assess, while continuing to enable the benefits. Next slide, please, Tori. Again, we have a lot more specific and recommendations and examples drawn from these real-world examples from the organizations we engage with that you can find in the appendix to our report. Next slide, please. I wanted to sort of conclude the prepared remarks before we moved into our discussion, was highlighting some top takeaways beyond the accountability wheel. We found that across every sector that we engage with, AI transformation coupled with accountability is emerging as a business priority, as a mission priority. But what's really interesting, and this goes into the second point here, is I think a lot of folks come into the notion of accountability as a defensive thing, as a way of ensuring not getting in trouble, ensuring compliance. But we're seeing forward-thinking organizations looking at accountable governance of AI as a smart investment. If they're in business, for their business, if they're nonprofit, for advancing their mission, not only for reducing that legal compliance risk, but for building trust with new generations of clients and customers, and as a competitive differentiator to show a willingness to explore new ways to make impact. The next point, and I know it's one you and I have talked about, Terry, is this notion of tone from the top as being crucial and responsible for AI programs. This doesn't work unless senior leadership, board-level executives take seriously the establishment of organization-wide principles, values, and commitments for accountable governance of AI, which are then cascaded throughout the organizations. Successful organizations are viewing accountability in AI as a shared responsibility that every employee can and should contribute to. Here at Simple, we engage a lot with policymakers and regulators, and also with organizations that are engaging with those bodies. And we are finding that organizations want regulators and policymakers to give clear guidance for what expectations are for systems to manage those inevitable legal compliance issues. Going back to the design of the internal AI governance program, we found that a risk-based and technology-agnostic approach is what is most effective. What am I talking about here? This gets back to the first question that Sergey, one of our attendees, asked at the beginning of the session today about, gosh, aren't the technologies changing quickly? What do you do? Well, organizations are recognizing that, yes, the technologies are changing fast, and the solutions of choice may change over time. But that's why the principles behind those choices have to be timeless, and they have to apply regardless of the particular solution or the service that we're using today. We've also said that convergence around common AI-related terminology is essential. We've talked a lot about AI today, for example, but we haven't talked about specifically the kind of services we are and are not talking about. Good AI governance depends on our using a shared vocabulary for core concepts, including, once we establish this kind of a program, what things in our organization, what technology is within scope of that program, and what is not, and is subject to other policies and controls. And our seventh point here, organizations are constantly adapting and updating their frameworks. Again, I hope we're not sounding like a broken record there. But one thing that I think is really interesting in the organizations we studied, and they probably apply to each of you, is many organizations have had AI of different sorts in place for a long time. well before ChatGPT, well before chatbots. Machine learning has been powering things, whether it's finding new donors for fundraising platforms, whether it's identifying new customers. And many organizations had AI policies in place 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. And it's not that generative AI has caused them to throw everything out and start anew, but to adapt from the best of what they've built before. The eighth finding we had here is that multidisciplinary and diverse teams are invaluable. Regardless of where AI governance responsibility ultimately situates in terms of sort of a final accountable officer, the teams addressing it have to be everyone. And that's across business functions, product, communications, legal, and IT. And this is not only to ensure that folks understand the principles that we're trying to implement, but actually because everybody in the organization has something to contribute here. In terms of understanding, mapping AI to the mission, mapping AI to be as effective as it can be in our organizations, everybody brings a unique perspective from the work that they're doing to contribute to that, and also from the core facets of who they are. Some of the biggest problems we have with AI are bias around things like race, around sex, around age. And when folks bring that perspective into our governance program, that can actually be one of the most effective fail stops to spotting such problems and stopping them early. Organizations find value in benchmarking against peers. This can be hard because benchmarking is a great way to learn from each other about what each other is doing, but it also requires some vulnerability, right? It's being open about the things that we have and haven't figured out yet, but finding and creating those safe spaces for sharing and figuring out how to collectively do better is vital. And finally, the 10th point is really a reiteration of the first or of the seventh, where we talked about updating it constantly. But here, what I want to say is that I think for organizations that are building a program for the first time, definitely don't see it as a 3-month project that you will then be done with. It's kind of something that you're going to stand up on and keep iterating on constantly over time. With that, Terry, I'll conclude my prepared remarks and send it back over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matthew. No, I really appreciate the going through all of those findings, and we can pull up on more slides as needed. I'm going to bring them down for now. One of the through lines that I heard as you were going through this was around developing governance, and you had mentioned this early on. At Orr Group, one of the things that we recommend to our partners is as a starting point, an early starting point, but maybe not the starting point. I'd love to get your take as what is the best starting point. You had a beautiful circle there, but with circles, there's not always a beginning and the end.
That's
so
right.
Let's drill into that. But the 3 things that we always recommend to our partners are creating 3 living documents. Again, tying to what you were saying about continuously updating, these should be living. The first, AI usage policy. That's to define internally how AI can be used, how to ensure it's being used responsibly, making sure that it's being checked for plagiarism. It's being make sure that you're taking steps to mitigate bias. The next document that we encourage people, our partners, to create is an AI governance. I know you had mentioned, you in the research, you talked to the head of governances. I don't know any nonprofits specifically with a head of governance, but I think creating governance can be an important step. And that is really just to define like how these tools are vetted, in collaboration with identifying the risks, how the tools are vetted, reviewed, approved. Who does that? Is leadership get involved, and where? And then how are they integrated into workflows? Who has access to them and when? And then the last one, which ties into transparency, we can talk a little bit more about transparency, but a disclosure on AI usage. This is basically a public-facing reiteration of the usage policy, the governance, so that it says to anyone who's interacting with that organization, this is how they use AI because it's aligned with their practices, and this is how how they're doing it responsibly. I'd be curious to throw up another poll, and I know we got another question. Thank you. But if we could put up a question, the next poll question, which is, does your organization currently have an AI policy? Not talking about all 3. I'd love to know if you have all 3. Sure, you could chime that in on the chat. We're always interested in that. But if does your organization have an AI policy? And Matthew, I'd be curious as people are filling out this poll, like as a starting point, is how do you feel about those three things as a starting point?
I think they're great, Terry. I love the specificity of it. I can't disagree with a single piece of it. I think you've given really great sort of very precise sort of first steps that folks can do. What I will say is I could see where if you are a small organization, as you said, you might not. I could see having one person who's an attorney in the staff, or if that, or one person who's managing everything. I mean, I look. There's all different sizes and scale, and it would be easy. I could see someone kind of throwing up their hand and saying, "You want me to do all of that, and within what amount of time?" I could say as a first uh, exercise is whoever's going to be involved in initial decisions is why are we even looking at AI in the first place? What are the goals that we're
Really
trying
good
to
point.
achieve? Put it on a whiteboard or an electronic whiteboard. What is our goal here? What are we trying to achieve? And what are the principles that we'll adhere to no matter what in turn when we're adopting AI along that journey there? Because having 5 or 6 principles that are sort of your North Star that everything flows from, I think is a great first place to start. And look, policies can be as elaborate as folks want them to be. I could say I would argue there's a hazard in them being too elaborate if folks can't keep track of everything that's in there. But I don't think folks should be overwhelmed by the notion of starting with at least a core North Star of what our core principles are.
Yeah, I think if you're just following the news and you're, paying attention to AI, all you see is opportunities, benefits, potential return on investment. Um, but there has to be some tie-in connection with what why your organization specifically and what you want to get out of it. So I think that's a really great first start. I'd love to see the poll responses uh, to see where we're at. Wow, another even split. We got some that are fully developed, some in development, no in but in planned, and no and not planned. I mean, to anyone on this call, I mean, I'm happy to have some conversations. I would love to see that number and no and not planned inch up, just because it does present some risk. But if you're an organization that is of the mindset that AI doesn't align with what we're trying to do and I don't see any value in it, well, maybe that is, you certainly don't need a policy for something that you aren't intending to integrate in any way. Um, I would like to ask you another question, and please,
Sure.
I think at this point, keep the questions coming. I will kind of address them as it comes up. But Matt, another question for you. Um, you said the organizations that your team interviewed for on this paper were primarily large for-profit entities. You know, I think that what you've presented, in my interaction with our nonprofit partners, these things translate one to one. Usually finding that executive leadership, usually the guidance and governance built into it, diversity in who is participating and reviewing and seeing how it is crucial. All of these things align perfectly. I would be curious for your takes on scale, um, in terms of, if the scale of AI usage is smaller, would you approach anything differently?
Yeah, I think that from a principle perspective, not really in terms of the steps being the same, but I think it could be, like if we are looking at using one tool and only one tool for a long time, let's say it's a specific piece of software around how we spot new donors for our fundraising platform, I still think it's important that we have these principles in place, but it does focus the task a bit on really, and I think this gets into one of the questions that was asked us about sort of how we inspect specific pieces of software or businesses that we might be contracting with, versus if we're looking at something that's kind of enterprise wide and or organization wide across a range of different services, it is a different kind of task. I would love to use this as a momentary to kind of pivot. Could you share? I know I shared with you a slide where
Yeah.
um, you kindly prompted us to kind of think about some specific concerns for nonprofits in this space. Um, I think that whether it is a smaller organization or a larger one. I think a real difference from the for-profit sector to folks in the nonprofit space is, look, for everybody in any sector, trust is essential. But my gosh, if your bottom line at the end of the day is not the dollars that you earn, but the impact that you have in alignment with your mission, boy, making sure that that use of AI is aligned with that, I would argue is in some ways even more critical than it is in a mega, large multinational profit-making entity. So to answer your question on scale, the importance remains no matter what.
Yeah.
But it's a little bit different thought process, I think. I mean, look, we've already hinted at this, but also if you're smaller scale, and even if you're larger scale, the resource constraints are likely substantial, no matter what. Because let's be honest. I'm a strong believer in the benefits and the, forgive the business speak, but the ROI on investing in accountable AI governance. But it's a cost center in the short term, right? You've got to spend time to build these programs, on upskilling people. There are resources out there that don't cost a lot, and I think it's in part about finding those. There's certification programs from groups like the IAPP that are on AI governance that aren't that expensive, all things being considered. There are a lot of burgeoning online networks of sort of trustworthy AI experts and other online learning opportunities that I think are well worth exploring. And again, in addition to how we are thinking about our own use of AI, this question of our vendor relationships is absolutely vital, which is not only being a trustworthy deployer, but a smart and good consumer of artificial intelligence products. I would love to take this opportunity there was a question in the chat, I think it was, about assessing the practices of a business that might be a vendor to us for AI products, along with the services they provide. And here is where, just like in other aspects of life, I would say, and of work, applying the same principles of being a smart consumer. Good and responsible and accountable organizations in the AI space take transparency seriously. What does that mean? If they are selling AI systems, they're releasing along with it things that are called model cards, which is a fancy way of saying, or a system card, which says, this is the data that my model is trained on at a broad level. This is my system's capabilities. This is my system's limitations. These are the risks associated with using it. This is what you should know. This is what you should do with it and what you shouldn't. If they're not providing that information, you probably don't want to be using this system. And we've seen some unfortunate examples where some vendors of AI systems in places like human resources have discovered that more savvy consumers know the limitations of their service and don't want to use it. And so they're targeting less well-resourced organizations who might not be asking the right questions. So that's just a thing to look out for.
Yeah, that is, I mean, that kind of aligns with one of the things we focus on using AI securely. I'm going to bring this slide down if that's okay, Matthew. One of the things that we talk about when using AI securely, so data practices is a big thing when we're talking about responsible AI usage. And the first recommendation that we have is understand how that data is being used. And to your point, not all AI tools make that as crystal clear equally. And so that is a huge, that's a great takeaway here for looking into that. I mean, I have been guilty as the next person to clicking, I agree on the iPhone update terms and conditions. But when it comes to AI tools and me inputting, data that I don't want to get out there, I definitely take the time to look into how they're going to use it. And then aligning, the next recommendation we have there for our partners is align that with your internal policies, identify the risks and see where there are gaps. Because sometimes your internal policies, even if they weren't applying to AI tools at all, can easily it can be applied to that using the same kind of research and taking that time and figuring out what's missing. And then when in doubt, just anonymize everything. If you don't trust where the data is going, don't put any data in that you don't want to be publicly used and available. Um, Great. We'd love to keep questions going. So if anyone has questions, please use the Q&A box. Otherwise, Matthew and I are just going to keep talking, which is great on my end because I love to talk. But I we talked about a question that I have is, let's say a nonprofit's board, often that top level decision maker, at least in terms of aligning with the mission driven goals and values, let's say is hesitant to adopt AI into fundraising efforts, and maybe smartly so. How do you recommend communicating with them with to a building accountable AI governance as a step, and doing that risk assessment piece is most effective when it comes from the top down? So that's kind of takes three different parts of the recommendations that you shared and merging it all together in terms of how would you approach that?
So the scenario you describe is really interesting. I think what I'm hearing you say is maybe you've got executives who are hesitant to use it. I think what we're seeing a lot is sometimes you have that, but the unstated precedent to that is that line level staff in the organization are really eager to use it and are raising the question up the chain, say, hey, I heard about this new tool. People are saying it can do X or Y and help us find new donors in ways we couldn't before. Let's go. Can we go? And then the executives, ah! And my first reaction is that caution isn't a bad thing. The instinct for the caution is a good thing. That means you care enough about the potential consequences of not getting it right to proceed with care. So there are two options. One is to just stop, but another could be to say, all right, we know that we care about the risks alongside the benefits. Take that next step to go ahead and try and lay out those principles and to try and sketch out this sort of accountability approach. As we've tried to share today, there are some principles out there and approaches to get you started on that. But what you don't want, the worst outcome would be you think you've made a decision not to use these tools.
Mm.
Your staff want to use them anyways, and then folks are just using stuff left and right without the policies.
Shadow IT.
Shadow IT, exactly. It's everywhere. So why not take the time from the top to let people know, first of all, you hear them, you care as much as they do about the mission. You also care about helping them be more productive, but you also care about helping them do it the right way. And I think sometimes the word top down gets a bad name in a world where grassroots is often where it's at. And it is where it's at. But there is a role for leadership to say, we care about principles enough that we want to take the time to get it right.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you for that. I know you wanted to talk about transparency. So
Yeah.
let's talk about transparency. We just recently, Orr Group, I'm going to drop it in the chat here. It'll also be linked in the follow-up email. There was a recent article by the nonprofit Times, and that highlighted AI usage, transparency, and engagement. Over 1,400 nonprofits, and then on the flip side, they surveyed 1,500 nonprofit end users. So that's including members, donors, constituents. And one of the takeaways that was interesting from that was a transparency gap of sorts. So 83% of the nonprofits surveyed believed that they were being transparent with their AI usage. The users of those nonprofits, only 38% of those users believed that the nonprofits were being transparent, which is a 45% delta. So there's clearly a disconnect here between what an organization is thinking they are doing to be transparent and what the end user is feeling about transparency. We dropped the article. Matthew, we got a couple more questions, so I definitely want to make sure that we can address those, but I'm interested to hear, I don't know if you have any thoughts on, I think some of the takeaways that you have, the best practices, laying those out from an organization, and then and hitting those can actually help close that transparency gap, making sure that your users. But I'd be interested to hear if you have any thoughts on that, and then we can check out the Q&A.
So actually, I'm gonna tie it right to, we got a great question from Michael
Yes.
in the Q&A that I'm actually going to link right to this. So first of all, when you shared that stat with me this morning, to me that I was like, the first image I had was flashing bright red light. Oh no, I mean, if there's that much of a delta between what we think we're providing to our clients, customers, and what they perceive we are, that is a recipe for a very bad trust problem, because that means people don't believe what we are telling them or not telling them about how we're using IT and how we're using things to learn about them, and talk about a way to drive away people that we need to trust us. And the way to close that, and Michael, to answer your question, I would say yes, yes, 1,000 times yes. If you are using AI, you should not be afraid to be upfront about that. Actually, you should embrace it, to say, hey, in order to best achieve our mission, I don't know how to wordsmith it exactly, but we want you to know that we are using these services in order to do X, Y, or Z, because that immediately says we're not trying to hide anything. In fact, we're trying to do what we do better than we ever have before. And these are the tools that we're using, and check out this to learn more. And I think that's a vital part. I mean, when we use the word transparency, that's a fancy word for telling people what we're up to. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah, one of the things that we recommend, first of all, if you Google, I mean, you can find it on our privacy page below our privacy policy on our website. We do have a disclosure, Orr Group has a disclosure on how we use AI. You're welcome to check that out. I will also say, built in with our policy, and what we recommend our partners use with their policy, is make it clear the how and the when you need to say, I used AI on this. That could be as simple as a little tag that says, ChatGPT helped me generate this. But then a human reviewed it and approved it, but prior to it being released. You can define that however works best with your organization. There's obviously, each organization is going to be a little bit different, but a disclosure on AI usage can be extremely valuable, useful, and just is a surefire way. And actually, I think it's one of the things that we talk about in this transparency gap article. Just disclose it, how you're using it. Well, if you haven't defined how you're using it, make sure you do that, and then share how you're using it. And Sergey, I know you had a question about dangers of shadow IT use. We could probably put a whole webinar on just the dangers of that. But it basically, some of them are, you don't have control. You don't know how it's being used. Again, to the disclosure and policy, if you don't know how it's being used, you can't control how it's being used, and you can't mitigate that. So people, with every nonprofit organization, however they answered that poll earlier, there are users in your organization who are using AI. And so getting ahead of that can protect you. But you could talk about data breaches, you could talk about reputational damage, you could talk about just cybersecurity risks. Like you could many potential risks with shadow IT. And Matthew, I know you just put a link in the chat.
Yeah, no, I love where you're going, Terry. I was just going to say, just to give a specific example of the risks, last month, the Texas Attorney General had a lawsuit with it was a settlement for, I think, over $1 billion. Wow. Around a hospital system's use of a generative AI tool that was making false claims about their accuracy, and what it could do and not do. And when you talk about shadow AI, if the risk here is you could have folks using unvetted software to do things that don't do what they say they can, and you could frankly subject yourself to legal liability in that case, for whether it's harms that you never anticipated, or saying you're delivering certain services that you're actually not able to deliver with that tool in reality. You just want to avoid this.
Absolutely. Thank you. Well, we are at 1:58 p.m. Eastern time. So I'll just summarize some key takeaways. We've talked about the foundations of accountable AI and its importance. Definitely follow along with the document that is shared after this fact. We've talked best practices. Again, two of the slides, I think, talk about key digestible, easy to use, easy to integrate best practices that you can use to make your AI programs more accountable. And we've shared ways that nonprofits can leverage AI to advance their mission-driven initiatives. Matthew, any other takeaways that you want to share that hits the spot?
You really nailed it, Terry. Only one I would leave is hopefully this is the beginning of a conversation, not the end, and we would love to continue with folks.
Yeah, absolutely. I just want to say thank you very much to Matthew Reisman. I'm gonna go ahead and put up a contact slide just so everyone has this. Again, it'll be shared after the webinar as well. But I really appreciate the time. I really appreciate your insights and your participation. I want to thank everybody who is in attendance for the solid questions, for the interactions, for just staying tuned and taking the time to learn more and integrate more accountable AI practices and responsible AI practices into your own organization. So with that, I will leave it, but thank you all, and we hope to see you at a future Orr Group talk.
Thank you so much, Terry, and thanks everyone for taking